Tego, Ani, Buju, and welcome to this evening's public talk with Dr. Tiffany King. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined this evening. On behalf of OISE's Visiting Scholars Fund, the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning, and the Indigenous Education Network, Dr. Nxumalo and I are honored and delighted to host this public lecture with Dr. Tiffany King. The seeds for this public talk came from our shared research interests related to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. Our idea of hosting Dr. King as a visiting scholar came about last fall with plans for an in-person event, but we are delighted that we were able to move forward with so much interest in this virtual talk. Tickets have sold out twice for this event, so we are really happy to have everyone connect virtually. I would like to begin with a traditional territorial acknowledgement. Although I know we are all connecting from many different territories, this acknowledgement honors the traditional peoples in Dagaranto in which OISE rests on and from where we work, learn, and gather. This evening, I'll be reading words that were collectively written by Dr. Eve Tuck, Lindsay Dupree, and other members of the Indigenous Education Network. The University of Toronto rests on the shared lands and waters of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Dagaranto has a complex history and has been the home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples since time immemorial. It is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The Wendat Huron also have long, deep relationship with this land and water. Today, Dagaranto is home to many other Indigenous peoples from Turtle Island, South America, and across the globe. It is important that we acknowledge that we are working, teaching, and learning on these lands and consider what responsibilities we carry and how we can engage in meaningful commitments, expressions of relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility to land and water. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Tiffany King, a graduate of the University of Toronto, whose work helps us to understand what it means to engage in meaningful commitments of relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility by bringing important interruptions to humanist engagements with settler colonialism. Dr. Tiffany King is an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Georgia State University. Her research is situated at intersections of slavery and Indigenous genocide in the Americas. King's book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, argues that scholarly traditions within Black studies that examine Indigenous genocide alongside slavery in the Americas have forged ethical and generative engagements with Native studies and Native thought that continue to reinvent the political imaginaries of abolition and decolonization. King is also co-editor of an anthology titled Otherwise Worlds Against Settler Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism. Dr. King's work has been used in numerous courses here at OISE and theorized about across our programs. The interconnections between the liberation of Black people and Indigenous people on Turtle Island is a critical ongoing concern both within and outside the Academy. And it goes without saying that this work is timely and urgent. Before we begin, I want to express the desire of bringing deep care for Dr. King's work and respectful engagement within this space. There will be some time for Q&A at the end of the talk, and we ask that questions attend to this ethic of care by thinking about your participation in a way that centers the voices of Black and Indigenous participants. This talk will also be recorded and published on the IEN website. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiffany King.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. Thank you, Fikile. Thank you both for the invitation to be here with you at OISE. I sometimes forget that I'm a graduate, but I was reminded a week ago because I still have arrears and I'm working on that, on paying the University of Toronto back. But it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Indigenous Education Network. Thank you, Lindsay and Julie, for helping with the technology. Thank you for setting up just a thoughtful format. I appreciate the way that you invited people to engage us in question and answer. And I'm just gonna ask all the wonderful Zoom participants to please Send me good energy and prayers. A hurricane just ripped through here, so we're dealing with some power issues. I'm dealing with my own energy issues and getting situated. Realizing coffee is not helpful anymore. I drank some coffee and immediately crashed. So learning stuff about my body in the pandemic. But these are my roots. So I'm gonna push forward and be present. I think about Takaranto as the intellectual and political birthplace of my project. I would not be doing this project, and the book, The Black Shoals, would not exist without the community of folks that I met in in Toronto in 2006 and 2008, including Abby Solole and Christine Wuza, Alyssa Karen Cross, and Marika Schwant, Cyrus, who's a part of PJAC at the time, and just so many people who are doing such wonderful work. But let me start. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen, my PowerPoint. Jennifer, Fikile, can you see? Okay, cool. Yeah, so the way I want to start this is by doing what I call an acknowledgement in Black. And I've been doing this since I've been speaking about the book. I briefly mentioned the group Red, Bike, and Green in the preface to the Black Shoals, but I wanted to lift up their work to really honor the ways that Black struggle, particularly here in the city of Atlanta and in the South, and for centuries has been acknowledging and trying to presence Indigenous people who've been removed, right, and displaced through conquest and settler colonialism. And so in 2016, I attended or tried to participate on a 2-mile dialogical bike tour. I made it to the first site, not the second and the third, because I had not biked since I was a teenager and it was a little rough on these hills. But one of the things that Red, Bike, and Green did as a collective of Black folks who are queer, trans, non-binary, who are a part of deep movement work. So a lot of folks are coming from Southerners on New Ground, or coming from Sister Song, Solutions Not Punishment, or SNAPCO, and many folks are a part of Black Lives Matter Atlanta. So what they actually do and continue to do since 2016 is find ways to remap or counter map the city on Black terms in the face of gentrification. Atlanta, as many people have understood it to be, has been a chocolate city for a long time. And I think just this year flipped to about 50% white, 50% Black. So the racial landscape is changing. And so what Red, Bike, and Green does is they take up space through their movement on bikes, right? Recently just saw them busting through Kroger, which is our grocery store, through that parking lot and disrupting Black people's ability to park, right? I mean, they were doing it just to remap the space, but Black people were quite frustrated. But on this tour in 2016, the first stop that they made was to our MARTA stop, or our subway stop, which is an MLK station. It's named after Martin Luther King, and it's in his historic neighborhood where he grew up, Auburn. And they wanted to acknowledge that the first stop on their tour would be a place where they acknowledge the presence of Muskogee Cree people, whose ancestral land and territory is where Atlanta currently is, right? So again, to presence Muskogee Creek people in the space of Atlanta that has continually tried to erase it, and also presence the lives of enslaved people who were forced to build the railroad station that is now our current MARTA station. And another reason why I do that, beyond the important and critical role of always giving an acknowledgement of where I'm situated and where I do my work from currently, is to also remind myself that I deeply trust Black people, specifically Black radical struggle and the Black radical tradition. And I trust the ways that it acknowledges its entanglements and its relationships and generative conflict with Indigenous people. And so it was beautiful to arrive in Atlanta and see some kinds of resonances. Like certainly Atlanta is not the same landscape as Toronto, where there's a longer history of Black and Indigenous political struggle and intimacy and creative art making that I'm going to talk about later, but it does do it on its own terms. And what I needed to remind myself of in the Black Shoals is that Black people have been doing this work. There's often a different way that we attend to the work and we use a different language. So I really, really wanted to assert in this book that I trust Black people. And I was fortunate enough to have Stephanie, who's a grad student at OISE, reach out and talk about just the politics of that and affirming that, trusting Black people. And so this is where my book really begins. It's a book that stages an encounter between the two fields of Black and Indigenous studies or Black and Native studies from the space of Black study. And so the frames that anchor my work are in Black feminist, which I also call fleshy analytic, and Native feminist analytics. And so many of the folks that Black Studies is in conversation with, I'm also in conversation with. Many of the folks that you all study with, including Eve Tuck, Billy Ray Belcourt, I'm also in conversation with, and give me the intellectual and theoretical grounding to actually stage some of these encounters and imagine the sites that I'm working with as meeting grounds for Black and Indigenous study and Black and Indigenous politics, protest politics, healing justice work. I get to think through literature and poetics in the book, also maps and film and sculpture. And so these sites function as places where I can talk and think through Blackness and indigeneity simultaneously, right? Either they are places where they meet or places where they're actually inseparable. They co-constitute one another and cannot be pulled apart or thought about as distinct and discrete from one another. And so for folks who have not been able to read yet, I use the shoal as an organizing metaphor for my book. And this came to me definitely in the first draft of the manuscript, but actually in the later process of writing the first draft of the manuscript. For a long time, I was thinking with the shoreline or thinking with the literal as a space where you could take the two metaphors of land, terra, which tends to overdetermine Indigenous life, and also the oceanic or water, which tends to overdetermine Black life, and bring those together. I thought that for a while that natural space would be the shore, like many people do, but I wasn't comfortable with that. I was uncomfortable, particularly the way that shorelines could be incorporated into nation states and could become bounded territories that became functions and technologies of settler colonial and projects of conquest. So I was like, I need something else. And lo and behold, my own geography, a road that I travel and use on a daily basis, but had not paid sufficient attention to, was actually named Flat Shoals. And so on a particular afternoon where I had been struggling with my work and trying to complete it, I experienced a down moment where other kinds of thoughts were able to come to me. And it finally occurred to me to look up what a shoal was. So for people who are not familiar and haven't spent this kind of time in larger bodies of water or oceans, there are spaces, and it's pictured here, where the ocean floor does come up and touch or like push through the surface of the water. So I imagined this space where the ocean floor and the water, or what we understand as land and water touching, as a critical space that could do so much work for me. It resonated. Um, One, with a space of becoming, right? A space where a new kind of ecotone or a space where ecological systems touch um, could surface. It's also a shallow place that boats have a hard time navigating. So it could help me do a kind of work of disruption, particularly a disruption to the force and the space that white settler colonial studies takes up. And it also has a kind of elusive character that really worked well with the spaces where I wanted to think with both Sylvia Wynter and Catherine McKittrick, and how McKittrick was teasing out the demonic in Wynter's work. And so I was like, this is just such an ideal kind of geological form to deal with. And it was just such a blessing to encounter it and work with it. And so I think about the shoal in 5 different ways in the 5 substantive chapters of my book. It does erotic work in chapter 4 through a Black and Native love story. It helps me reimagine the plantation, particularly a plantation in what we now know as the US, as a space that can also surface indigeneity. I think that plantation landscapes, when they're overwritten with Black labor, often hide indigeneity. And so the shoal works there. The shoal is a way of thinking about, in chapter 2, a map that was written in the 18th century to chart out conquest. Rereading it, it becomes a map of what McKittrick calls Black Atlantic livingness and also Indigenous livingness. And I'm going to spend some time today talking about chapters 1 and 5 and the ways that they introduce the book and close out the book. And chapter 5 gives me some more space just to talk about my indebtedness to the practice of Black study that's going on here in Canada, and just what it's been able to do for the book. And the first chapter is in conversation with that 5th chapter as a counterpoint. And so I'm going to start here with the first chapter. So in the city of Toronto, like many of cities in the US and around the world, activists, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and multiracial coalitions are tearing down monuments to slavery, conquest, repression, and otherwise what I'm calling conquistador humanisms. So it's been interesting to think about this first chapter this year. While I appreciate that it's still relevant, the way that the landscape is peppered and shaped by violence is disturbing. And the fact that there are arguments about defending, for instance, the presence of someone like Columbus on a waterfront is a problem. And the reason why I opened the book with this was for several reasons. I wanted to find a figure, and I'm thinking about Columbus's inauguration and other explorers and conquistadors from Southern Europe who were both off of the coast of Africa in the 1440s, and certainly in what we now know as the Americas in 1490s. And I wanted to think about them as shared subjects that Black and Indigenous people for centuries have had to contend with and have had to fight in order to develop and create another kind of humanity in opposition to what I call a conquistador humanism, which is a kind of being human that requires Black and Indigenous death. And this was a space or a kind of connective tissue where I argue that Black and Native studies meets. And it was important for me to think about um, conquest specifically as a space that names a particular violence that I argue that at times white settler colonial studies disavows, right? There is a particular way that certainly white settlers, when they talk about settlement and perhaps even their positionality as settlers, don't do the same kind of political, theoretical, or effective work that someone like, for instance, Nxumalo Trask does when she names Paolis and white supremacist settler colonialism in Hawaii. They're different. They ring different and they do a different kind of work. And there's something about Nxumalo Trask and Indigenous feminists. I'm thinking here particularly of Joanne Barker, who, are saying there's something about settler colonialism, particularly when it comes from white settler colonial studies. It's just not harsh enough. It's a bit tepid. And I thought about the ways that Black feminists and Indigenous feminists are able to think about the creation of Black and Indigenous flesh, certainly emerging from sites of terror, but also having a kind of flip side to indicate life. And there's something about the ways that our fields have had to push back on this category of the human that I wanted to center because I thought it was a critical space where there's a deep engagement and we might be creating a different kind of lingua franca or a way of code switching with one another that happened on Black and Indigenous terms and wasn't as mediated by white settler colonial studies or white critical theories. And so this chapter was really important for me to open the book and say that there are ways that Black people have been talking to Indigenous people or that we could be talking to one another that doesn't always have to be rooted through white leftist forms of critical theory, right? And of course, in my newer work, I'm thinking about the language that Black and Indigenous people are using and creating together about ecologies and land. So that's work that I'm really excited about, like thinking about our ways of code switching with one another and creating language as Black and Indigenous people. And I also wanted to focus then on a juxtaposed image of another kind of figuration of human as a form of praxis. And I see this in the work of Charmaine Lurch. And I use her as a counterpoint to the cenotaph of Columbus, right, who's this hard stone, supposed to be permanent, unchanging kind of figure of a violent kind of humanism, to think about the ways that we can be otherwise. And so I focus on her sculpture for a number of reasons. One, because of the openness of the form, the way that she invites through the wiring of wires, an entanglement between Indigenous femininity and Black femininity, and that these particular kinds of subjectivities must be in relationship with one another in order for each of the respective kinds of forms of Blackness or indigeneity to even exist, right? Our existence is not singular. So Blackness and indigeneity are always already entwined with one another. And one of the beautiful things about working with Charmaine is a generous, generous artist who spent a lot of time, was extremely patient with me as someone who is new to thinking critically about form and Black aesthetics, is that she delighted in some of our conversations, and I delighted in some of our conversations about her engagement with Sylvia Wynter's work and Anna Ford Smith's work and Catherine McKittrick's work and Dion Brand's work. And she's like a serious scholar who can do things that I can't do. And certainly a lot of my colleagues who are academics but not artists can't do, which is translate some of the Black feminist stuff that we read and work with primarily in words into form, right? And so like the ways that she thinks about form and with these scholars is brilliant. And it took my mind to places that I couldn't conceive of before engaging her. Another reason why I appreciate her is because she helps me think about what kind of Black study is happening in Canada that is critical for my own work. And just thinking, seeing a post from folks, Black Canadian scholars, about the institution, universities finally acknowledging like the centuries long practice of Black study and finally catching up and making some meager concessions to give it resources. But I wanted to think about her critically as a form of Black study that is already entangled with Indigenous movements for sovereignty, Indigenous politics, Indigenous artists. And that is something that was really unique. And my work, I wouldn't have been able to do this work without thinking with Black Canadian scholars, activists, and artists. And so I'm going to actually conclude with reading a bit from the chapter where I focus on revisiting Sycorax, which is this sculpture. So this is from chapter 5. Let me show you Charmaine in action, actually working on revisiting Sycorax. So Lurch invents her own diasporic ceremony of shaping new encounters and new spaces through sculpture. In essence, she invents traditions that create conversations among, for instance, Lucian Thornton Blackburn, who are escaping the United States, Sycorax traveling between the Caribbean and North Africa, and Henrietta Lacks, whose cells are dispersed across the galaxy as diasporic subjects that traverse, produce, and undo the spaces of the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. These Black diasporic subjects touch in time and space in Toronto while also remaking what we know as Toronto through Lurch's art. While Lurch's and Walcott's work produce a conceptual, analytical, and creative center, albeit temporarily in shifting, in the space of Black Canada, I argue that Lurch sculpts and shapes Black Canada into a nodal point that functions as a shoal. Lurch pulls Black American of the Americas subjectivity, politics, and aesthetics away from the mainland of the United States and the shorelines of the Caribbean to the shoals of exilic movement. Lurch uses various Black diasporic subjects movement at the level of genes, bodies, transit systems, and colonial specter away from nation-bound approaches and rigid scales of analysis. In this way, Lurch practices an undisciplined, coming from McKittrick, and radical form of Black placemaking. Lurch's work attends to the ways that North American Blackness, and I'm pulling from Ronaldo Walcott here, or North American Black life contests national borders and respatializes Black life by connecting the experiences of exile of Lucy and Thornton Blackburn, Henrietta Lacks, and Sycorax at Ronaldo Walcott's in-between space of Canada. By wiggling points and lines, Lurch transforms the exhibit spaces in Toronto into a demonic site that takes on the dimension scrambling characteristics of the Tesseract. By situating Sycorax in relationship to North American Blackness in the space of the Toronto Center for the Arts Gallery, the Caribbean can also momentarily fold into place as a central node. This kind of simultaneity is embedded within the twists, bends, and wiggling lines of Lurch's sculpture revisiting Sycorax. Sycorax's formation is possible only through the tangling lines, or the tangling together and intertwining of Black and copper wire. Black femininity is dependent on the existence and persistence of Indigenous femininity for its own survival. In addition to tying Black and Indigenous existence together, Lurch's Sycorax rearranges geographies of conquest. The spatial implications of her corrective to and transporting of Sycorax as a symbol of the figurative and historical erasure of Black and Indigenous femininity that occurs within Shakespeare's account of discovery. This transporting of Sycorax to Canada from the Caribbean produced a geographical rupture. Lurch's sculpture enacts a geographical shift or her own respatialization of conquest by transferring the landscape and the sites of conquest that are the bodies of Black and Indigenous females to the Canadian landscape. Within both Indigenous, in this case Taino and Arawak, and Black diasporan Caribbean hermeneutics, and interpretations of the tempest, the Caribbean becomes a space of encounter. While the two communities tussle with each other over the racialization or representation of Caliban and therefore of Sycorax as Indigenous, Black, or Mestizo, some semblance of consensus emerges about the where of the epic narrative of the inaugural events of New World discovery. As several Black studies scholars have argued, the story of modernity in the New World begins in the basin of the Caribbean. The violent rupture that created the time, space, and people of the Caribbean also created the Americas, including Canada. Thinking about the Caribbean as the birthplace of the New World in the Americas renders Canada a child of the Caribbean. To imagine Canada, we thus must first imagine the Caribbean. We must first imagine the place from which Lurch and her family traveled. We must imagine the genocide of the Taino people and the enslavement of African people in the Caribbean before we can even imagine the birth pangs of Canada. The Caribbean begat Canada. Similarly, Indigenous and Black women's bodies make the Americas North America and Canada even possible. Situating the figure of Sycorax and the Caribbean in the nation space of Canada also enacts a flipping of the map of Americas. It turns the map of the Americas, specifically Canada, the United States, North America, and its supposed archipelagos of the Caribbean on its head. Through recognizing the Caribbean basin and its islands as the geological forms or shoals themselves, and island epistemology breaks through the surface and is brought to bear on the epistemologies and cartographies that have produced what we now know as the United States and Canada. So rather than repeating islands or island territories as units of possession, the Caribbean archipelagos and shoals of 1942 that Lurch transports north to Canada and centers through the figure of Sycorax reproduce Canada as another island. Sycorax's presence as an island subject or subjectivity transforms the mainland territory or space of Canada into another island territory. If the Black Canadian subject is deconstructed and imagined as a moving geographical subject emerging from the diasporic space of enslavement in the Caribbean, its Canadianness is radically upended. Further, if Blacknesses and Sycorax's island subjectivity has to be accounted for, so does the US and Canadian mainland's taxonomization and geological categorization as non-island space. Lurch's remapping of the Americas resonates with Walcott's exilic thought and Brand's Gospel of No Nation. Walcott's work calls for a reimagining of the Black diaspora in North America, or a Black North American studies that is less bounded. These kinds, my apologies, these kinds of respatializations of Canada and North America begets a question: what kind of shoaling or disruption does the Black and Indigenous Caribbean cause to Canada and the Americas? I want to end with Charmaine Lurch's rendering, her sketching of a Sycorax gesture, which is actually the cover, graces the cover of my book, which she explained to me as her process, which started, this was before 2015, but she and her creative partner, Mosa Neely, were working on a 2-woman play that referenced my dissertation. I couldn't believe it, I was horrified, but nonetheless, like what they were able to think about, particularly with Julie Dash's Indigo, they were working on a 2-woman performance and Mosa Neely was dancing and she was sketching Mosa in movement. And then this image, the sketch, becomes almost like a blueprint for her sculpture that you saw a few slides before of revisiting Sycorax. So I just wanted to end with that and think about the kinds of Black generative creative moments that actually are occurring in the space of Charmaine's work, and also the kind of Black study that's happening in Canada. And end my talk there. Thank you. I hope this was sufficient. I look forward to talking more with people and perhaps being clearer in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that inspiring talk. So before turning to questions, I just wanted to say how inspiring your work has been to myself in thinking with Black and Indigenous relationships in my own context of my field of environmental and place-based education. Last semester, I had the wonderful experience of introducing your book to students in my grad seminar, and it was really generative to think about your work alongside questions of enduring and unevenly distributed environmental precarity. So as Dr. Brant said at the beginning, as you submit your questions, my hope is that we can continue the ethos of care and generosity that Dr. King has brought to the gathering. So we'll take a few minutes and people can type questions in the Q&A box. While we're waiting, maybe I can just ask a question. One of the ways in which I find your work really inspirational is the ways in which it attends to what I see as the difficult work of troubling Euro-Western modernist humanism or human centricism, at the same time as working against the dehumanizing effects of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the ways in which you approach thinking about human subjectivity without reinscribing modernist humanist concerns. So for example, I think in that wonderful example of the indigo stained hands in the film that you discuss in your book.
No, thank you. I think that existing in that tension of not reifying these kind of humanist claims, or I'm thinking a little bit now with Shona Jackson, like onto-epistemological investments and things like labor, but on the other hand, not dipping into and staying in the dehumanizing violence, like maintaining that tension between not wanting to fully claim kind of humanity, but also not being invested in deconstructing the ways that we are made lesser humans, right, or provisional humans. Requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of reading. It requires a lot of reading your work, specifically reading McKittrick's work, of reading Gilmore's work, and having that that appeal to always be attentive to and presence, not only just Black livingness as a kind of abstract thing, but your own livingness and breath, right? Because I'm also writing about myself and people that I know, right? And what we cannot claim, but we can also make, right? And so I think that also taking seriously, and I'm thinking about this in my newer work where I'm trying to deal more attentively and pay more attention to what I'm calling Black and Indigenous feminist analytics of the flesh. Like there's something about when I think Black and Native women do materialisms, we can, for instance, call out some problems with our investment in labor, even in its most radical form as organized working class people thinking through Marx. Like it's our investment in labor actually enacts some kinds of ontological and racial forms of violence against what we know as land, what we know as animals, and what Europe would know as non-working people, right? Black people and Indigenous people who are not squarely within civil society or part of the proletariat. And so thinking with the ways that Black and Indigenous women map that violence through their own materiality and flesh, but also name something else outside of an imaginary work that still holds on to creative activity and capacity and world building. That bothness is a choreography that has to be practiced. I'm still kind of training my muscles, and will always be training my muscles to do it, because we're just so inundated with death all the time, right? I mean, literally, I'm processing a hurricane that just went through a very Black city that started in New Orleans. It came through my Black city, and also the ways that Black violence, or not, that anti-Black violence of the police has stolen another life this week in Philadelphia. So being in that space or that tension is something that we have to work at. And so, and thank you for your work for helping me do that, Fikile, as well.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions here. Can you talk more about the links you're making between flesh in terms of Black and Indigenous understandings? Thinking here, of course, about Spillers and, say, Audra Simpson's articulations.
Thank you for that question, whoever that was from. No, I absolutely have been thinking with both of those texts because I just had to draft a keyword entry on flesh for a gender and sexuality studies keyword reader. But I have definitely been thinking about Spillers alongside Audra Simpson and I guess Teresa Spence's fast or fish broth fast, in the ways that certainly the Canadian state renders Indigenous flesh as needing to disappear and be gone, and her resistance to that, right? And her survival and persistence. So that kind of the two-ness, right? Or the reversibility of flesh in that case that Audra Simpson maps out so wonderfully for us, that it certainly emerges from a space of terror, but then has a flip side, or what we might say in Black studies, a loophole of retreat, if we're thinking about Harriet Jacobs in Hortense Spillers' article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, right? It's a radical space of rearrangement, even though it gets removed from the proper territory of gender, of human gender or patriarchal gender. I think that that space of the flesh and how it comes up, not just in Audra Simpson's work, but also maybe Christos, Joy Harjo. I'm thinking about some of the Indigenous women who were writing in This Bridge Called My Back, who were also naming flesh as things that, as fleshy things that existed beyond the human, right, as land. It's a generous space to think with, to think both Black studies, particularly Black feminisms and Indigenous feminisms together. And I'm grateful for also Chad Infante for reminding me of Audra Simpson's work and to think more closely with it with Hortense Spillers. So that's what I'm thinking right now.
Thank you. So thank you very much for your lecture. Black radical tradition is strongly connected with transnational travels of Black activists worldwide. So wondering what your thoughts are about your book in a transnational perspective, for instance, between Black activists and Indigenous communities transnationally.
No, thank you for that question. I haven't thought about probably the transnational beyond the Anglophone Caribbean and Canada. So I certainly think about its travels, explicitly its travels between here, Canada, and the Anglophone Caribbean. But that's a good question for thinking about it in South America, Lusophone speaking, Spanish speaking, Francophone speaking Caribbean. I would wonder if some of these terms would travel, particularly the settler colonial terms. I'm wondering if people in those other spaces in the Americas could vibe with me around conquest. That was a part of the move there. But I wonder how this book would be taken up in South Africa, for instance, as I'm thinking now of T.J. Talley's work, which does critical work of naming that colonial formation as settler colonialism, and also like a space where explicitly Blackness is named as Indigenous in ways that that indigeneity doesn't get affixed or travel with the bodies of people who traveled through the transatlantic slave trade, but also wondering, I have my own questions about indigeneity in West Africa, specifically Ghana, in the spaces that Sadia Hartman was talking about with Lose Your Mother. And that conversation of African indigeneity, particularly West African indigeneity, and its capaciousness is one that's interesting for me, because I'm wondering when I have tried to do this, when I have tried to argue for my own indigeneity because of my roots, my ancestral or genetic roots in West Africa as an indigenous person who is displaced from there, I don't know that that works for me. So I would love to think about indigeneity across the African diaspora with people, particularly on the continent, and see what the critical purchase of that term is from space to space. That will be one of the conversations that I would want to have through my book. So that's what's coming to mind as far as transnational circuits of the Black radical tradition, for sure.
Thank you. I have a long one here. Hi, Dr. King. It's always a pleasure and honor to be in the space and learn from you. In the Brant Grammars chapter that you referenced, you discussed the defacing of the Columbus statue as a restaging of the scenario of conquest. If the defacing restages conquest, what do you think interventions such as Lurch's restage are the ways that we can imagine the work of people such as Lurch and yourself as a tertiary act? I'm not sure what that's, to an otherwise scenario altogether. Thank you for the presentation. You want me to repeat that one, or?
I think I have it.
Okay.
Like, what kind of challenge or restaging of beingness or humanness is happening with Lurch's cigarettes? Like, challenge is being asserted. In addition to a kind of a coexistence or understanding a self as already connected to or radically implicated in another's survival, I think it's also a particular kind of ethics. Let me unpack that. Something that's coming to mind for me right now, what I think Charmaine Lurch's work is a great object lesson for, would be in conversations that I've seen Black folks try to have with this creator, this director and writer, Misha Green, who has written Lovecraft Country. I don't know if people have been following it here as closely as Black people in the States have been, which I think is fascinating and it does incredible work for me. I'm more compelled by her work in Underground, which is a television series that got canceled that followed a community of fugitive slaves or fugitive folks who were enslaved. I think that work is incredibly brilliant, but something happened in Lovecraft Country where I think it was the third or fourth episode where she's creating these incredible worlds by reworking like a Lovecraftian horror sci-fi journal, like these incredible worlds of Black livingness that transcend dimension and space-time, but at the same time did some violence to Indigenous, particularly in Arawak, two-spirited or perhaps even a trans or intersex person. And I don't think they were even clear about the Yahira's subjectivity, but it was a violent erasure of that person while you had Black life being presented on the stage. And I wish for her a kind of engagement with Indigenous creatives and Indigenous story makers to come to a different place. I think that was a mapping of a particular kind of conquistador humanism that was taken up by a Black US person to bring Black humanity to the stage. And I think the kind of creative work that Lurch does challenges us to do something else, to be able to hold the humanness of Black folks and Indigenous folks together and not be able to disentangle them to make claims to breath, to life, to world making. And so I think that her work and an engagement with her work allows you to create other kinds of vistas and worlds for Black and Indigenous life that are not on terms of conquest. And so I just continue to think with Lurch about her kind of radical positionality of a deep relational kind of existence, right? that I think she just does so beautifully, that I really wanted to be a kind of counterpoint, a way to end the book that started with a Columbus figure.
Thank you. Thank you for your brilliant work, Dr. King. Your references to hurricanes today are curious, given how you position the Caribbean analytically in your work, which I really appreciate. Hurricanes comes from the Arawak-Tainoa hurricane, and it speaks to the concreteness of Caribbean lived experience. How would you imagine your work speaking back to that reality and contributing to how we theorize the concrete experience of living in the islands of the Caribbean?
That is a beautiful and rigorous question. I feel so unqualified to speak to. I think, I mean, a moment to pause certainly was with Hurricane Maria, and thinking with folks in Puerto Rico, specifically Afro-Puerto Rican scholars who have been able to show us like scenes of life post-hurricane, also Bahamas, and how folks, for me, particularly my kin from the Bahamas, show up and have to create life both in Wilmington, Delaware, where some of them have relocated, and in the Bahamas at the same time. So creating multiple kinds of spaces of stability. It has a concrete to it, whether it's in the Bahamas or in Wilmington. So there is a concreteness there, even though it's not the same. I am not going to say much more because I am not a Caribbean studies person, but I think that that question and its particular connection to the indigenous roots of the word hurricane, like gives it a longer kind of time frame to think about the concreteness of Black and Indigenous Caribbean life, that we have to probably think with in order to not create solutions, but to live with the terms of climate injustice and how we kind of remake life in the Caribbean and to places where people will be migrating to. So I'm gonna pause and defer to Caribbean scholars on that and read their work about that. That's a heavy question. That's a heavy question. And something that the South, Black people in the South, particularly in cities like mine and New Orleans, will have to be in discussion with folks in the Caribbean about as well.
Okay, there's many questions here. One question is about if you could talk a little bit about how Indigenous feminisms allow you to think about Indigenous sovereignty in different ways, perhaps in less patriarchal ways.
No, definitely Indigenous feminisms, particularly the way that specifically Moral and Miley Arban and Eve Tuck were thinking through heteropatriarchy and thinking about Native Indigenous challenges to heteropatriarchy, to rethink sovereignty on terms of relationality and a kind of dynamic shifting space that can be deeply collaborative, particularly with Black folks, and making other kinds of worlds, like guided certainly my thoughts on how I thought about sovereignty, particularly in chapter 4 through erotic landscapes, and how I pushed back on some of the literature, specifically Afro-pessimist literature that had critiques of sovereignty, which I think their critiques of sovereignty were valid, but I think that their critiques of sovereignty were critiques of a masculinist kind of sovereignty. And they were not deeply informed by the work that Indigenous feminists, particularly folks like Leanne Simpson, have done with sovereignty. So it was helpful to read those particular articulations and iterations and manifestations of sovereignty to do the intellectual work. But I also, as I'm speaking, realize that I came from a space in Toronto working with Christine Luza and Marika and Abby and Larissa, that sovereignty, like on a very interpersonal level, particularly for Christine, who is an Anishinaabeg woman, could play out differently through relationships with Black women. So we got to remake what sovereignty meant on Anishinaabe and Indigenous feminist terms and Black terms all the time through our relationships with one another. So we have to also stop making sovereignty a hard and abstract concept in the beautiful way that Billy Ray Belcourt articulates that. Sovereignty is also, if we think about the human or humanity as a praxis, sovereignty is a praxis that changes all of the time, right? It does. It's not a hard thing that you can fix and then critique for the same faults across time and space, particularly depending on who's speaking about it and articulating it. So we have to read the works of Indigenous feminists to change our imaginations about what sovereignty can be, and not read their work, be in relationship with one another.
Thank you. So thank you for this talk. I love your theorizations about the water and the land and the reflections that you shared today. I wonder if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about the sky. I'm thinking about flight, birds, the connections between sky and water. If you'd like to comment on the place of the sky in island epistemologies, that'd be cool too.
I would like to comment by saying I am so excited by Karen Recollet's work on falling, right? In her thinking about choreography, and she said something so brilliant about Black and Indigenous people falling together, and what would that be? So she is someone who is definitely engaged with the sky as an Indigenous feminist thinker. And that's something that I'm excited to do more of, but I don't have my own comments on it today. But, and thank you for helping me think about island studies relationship to the sky. But no, Karen's work. Karen's work, I want to say.
Thank you. I'm not seeing anything else that jumps out here. There was just maybe a general question, if you could say a little bit more about shoaling and the work that it does. Just.
Yeah, I leaned on it a lot to do a lot of different things. I had a wonderful colleague, my colleague Leah Bascom. Was like, it's doing everything. You might need to stop and put some parameters on it. But what it offered was so generative, just as a space to think about not just things coming together. If you think about that image that I showed of sand or floor coming through ocean water. So yes, as a meeting space, but also as a space to radically rethink where our boundaries are. Like, is that a coming together of two things? Is that a particular kind of wholeness or fullness of the ocean that we have not accounted for? It helps me think of ocean spaces far more complicated and complex and infinitely world in a way that I had not been able to imagine before. And also that the space of the shoal moves. So what was helpful about that is that it allowed me not to rest in historic accounts of Indigenous brutality against Black people, Black brutality against Indigenous people, or what we think of as resolution through these revolutionary coalitions, the Seminole Wars, but as being in a space of radical connectedness, but also generative conflict that we know has happened, but we also don't know when that conflict or that the possibility for solidarity is going to emerge. So a kind of the shoal as a disruptive force and a moving elusive force puts you in a position of always having to be ready and always having to be able to adjust and respond because of the way that it's it can't always be pinned down, which is another element of it that I think is so generative. It's a space of becoming. It's a space where you can't always in advance plan for what your politics are going to be. You have to be deeply kind of entangled and encumbered by another, right? It's a space of non-separation. We got to figure out things together. And I think that's what was so lovely about shoaling in that kind of verb form, to just be in radical kind of process, and that movement of the shoal from space to space, and it's re-emerging and kind of dissolution is the way I wanted to think about Black and Indigenous politics, like for centuries and for centuries to come, right? A kind of an ability to be dynamic and adjusting. And so that's another feature of it that I really appreciated. And it just gave a lot for chapter after chapter after chapter, right? It could change and move with me.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end of our questions. There are many thank yous in the comments for your work, but I think I'll pass it over to Jennifer to close us off.
So Dr. Tiffany King, on behalf of the Visiting Scholars Fund, the Curriculum Teaching and Learning Department, and the Indigenous Education Network, Dr. Nxumalo, and myself, thank you so much for your work. This has been deeply moving and inspiring and beautifully articulated. And of course, in addition to the questions, I'm not sure if you were able to see all of the praise for your work. I also want to thank our sponsors. So as I mentioned, OISE's Visiting Scholars Fund, the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning, and the Indigenous Education Network. And I want to express sincere gratitude for your work and for prayers to you and the communities affected by the hurricane during this time. And I want to wish everyone, all of the attendees, a safe, warm, and wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I felt the prayers. Thank you for getting me through.
Thank you.